Black mystery. Now, a lot of people, I'm sure, even within the UFO field, whenever you mention the Men in Black, they probably inevitably think of the Men in Black movies with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, which are kind of like entertaining, action-packed adventure films, um, which is what they're designed to be. But they really only sort of portray one aspect of the mystery, which is actually far bigger than the movie would sort of have you believe or demonstrate. Now, a lot of people don't realise that the Men in Black movies were based on a comic book franchise of the same name. And the comic books were based upon stories of people who said they'd been visited by real life Men in Black after UFO encounters and told not to talk about their experiences and, were silenced and threatened. So that aspect at least does tie in with the movies. But where the big difference comes in is that in the movies, the guys, the MIB, are basically sort of described as agents of a secret government body. It's sort of deeply buried in the Pentagon or within the government. And they go around, officially or unofficially silencing and warning people not to talk about what they've seen. The reality of the Men in Black mystery is actually quite different to that. And the idea that it's all just connected with Pentagon agents, dress up in black suits like the FBI and intimidate people is only, it is a genuine aspect of the subject, but it's only actually part of the subject. It's not sort of the overall mystery. And so that's one of the reasons why, you can just go on to the next picture, John. I decided to write a book about the subject called The Real Men in Black to demonstrate to people that there's much more going on as well. Now, one of the other perceptions a lot of people have in the UFO subject is that the Men in Black, because the sightings and encounters really kicked off in the late 40s and early 50s and through to the 60s, a lot of people think it's an old mystery, that they kind of went away and, they're not around anymore. It's like a lot of people view it, oh yeah, that was those guys, 40 years ago, who used to dress like gangsters or whatever and silence, people in the UFO field. One of the things I found doing research was that the number of Men in Black reports that are on file is actually no less today than they were 40, 50, 60 years ago. The big difference is that what I've found is that because the sort of the stigma attached to the movies, people are more reluctant to talk about Men in Black encounters today because they're worried about getting the response, oh, you've been overdosing on Hollywood films or the X Files, and people laugh at them. And so I think what's happened is that the reports are no less, but the reluctance of the witnesses to talk about them makes it seem we're getting less reports. And the more I dug into it, I found that was the exact opposite. So that was again one of the other reasons to write the book, was not just to point out the reality of the Men in Black, how it's quite different to the film, but demonstrate that it's still something that's very much ongoing today. And the next one, please. Now, many people kind of describe the Men in Black in fiction, in the Hollywood films. If you see the Tommy Lee Jones, the Will Smith films, they look like normal, regular people, the sort of thing you would see, if the FBI came knocking on your door, etc. They're sort of big guys, trained to deal with fraught situations. The real Men in Black are very different, and this is a picture drawn by a friend of mine named Simon Wyatt, and he kind of pictures sort of the imagery of the Men in Black, these sort of shadowy, sinister, skinny guys almost, who don't really sound like anything that sort of come out of the government. They're often described as sort of only being sort of 5 feet to 5'5" tall, very skinny, pale-faced, almost like they've got anemia or anorexia or both, or some, serious disease. And they wear, even today, they wear these old sort of 1940s and 50s fedora hats that sound like, they come out something straight out of a 1950s gangster movie or something like that. So everything about the Men in Black is sort of odd, very strange, and people remember it because they are so strange. So in other words, again, this is something that really goes against the grain of the image that we have of the MIB and who they might be. Now, one of the things I found out doing the research is that when people say, well, who are the Men in Black? There could actually be several categories. There are these MIB who sort of come across very sinister, but there are also government people who wear black suits. And I think one of the things I found doing the studies and speaking to witnesses is that I think the government people actually sort of exploit the mythology of the weirder men in black to cover their tracks. So if somebody from the government wants to go out and request somebody not to talk about their UFO experiences, they may actually dress like this on occasion because then they know if the person talks about it, they're just going to get laughed at and be told, hey, you've just overdosed on Hollywood or whatever, bad dreams. So it's like a good sort of psychological weapon, if you like, to ensure that people don't talk about these events. Now, the mystery itself, for the most part, goes back to the early 1950s and a man named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender was a UFO researcher who lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he's kind of a weird guy. He lived with his stepfather in the attic, excuse me, in the attic of his stepfather's house, which he converted into what he described as his sort of very own chamber of horrors. And he painted all the walls with like pictures of weird monsters and gargoyles and things like that. And he was going to turn it into like what he called his chamber of horrors, where he would charge people to come round, and there would be like floating skeletons hanging on strings and stuff like that. And this was sort of when he was like 32, 33 or something like that. And he'd have friends over, and it was meant to be just a bit of entertaining fun. But Bender from there kind of got more and more involved in the occult in the real world. He started dabbling in Ouija boards and finding ways to try and contact spirits and demonic entities and things like that, as he perceived them, like demonic entities. But at the same time, he developed a bigger interest in the UFO subject. And Bender set up a UFO group. He was living in a town called Bridgeport, Connecticut at the time. He set up a UFO group in '52 called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And the IFSB, a lot of groups, around the world look just like John's, like the MUFON group here. In cities all around the world, certainly all around the US, you'll probably find at least one or more, either a UFO group or a ghost hunting group or something like that. And that's what Bender did. And, a lot of the groups attract audiences like 50, 60, and everybody got to hang out like tonight and, and chat and discuss things. It's like a friendly conversational group meeting. For some weird reason, Bender's IFSB really took off massively. What happened was it attracted attention all around the world. And so instead of just being something in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he would have monthly meetings at the local library, he found himself literally answering letters and mail by the sackload on a daily basis from people who wanted to join the IFSB, wanted to talk about their UFO encounters. And of course, this was all pre-internet. This is sort of 52, 53, pre-internet, pre-faxes, so he had this sort of pretty angry mailman who every morning had to haul sacks of mail up the drive just to drop them off at Bender's house. And, he would literally come home from work at night, creep up to the attic and, sit there with a candle, as he said. It was an attic, like a weird attic. It even had the creaky floorboards, like something straight out of a horror movie. And he would answer mail. And as time went on, he thought, well, I've got so many followers, I'm going to set up a newsletter. So he set up a monthly newsletter magazine called Source of News. And this went on for like 4 or 5 months. And by this time, he had sort of like spin off groups of the IFSB set up in England, in Australia, all over the world. And it was really sort of becoming like a large force or a presence within the UFO research field in the early 1950s. But suddenly, out of the blue, about a year after he set up the IFSB, Bender literally out of the blue, without warning, closed the group down. And at first, people said, well, is this simply a ploy to get more publicity for his group? It's like if I say that something mysterious has happened, everybody's going to flock to me and want to know, and it's going to increase magazine sales, and etc., etc. That actually isn't what happened. Bender really did close it down and walked away from the subject, and he only briefly came back about 10 years later to write a strange book himself, which I'll talk about, which essentially told the story of his silencing. But he said But when the IFSB was at its height, and he was answering all these letters and sending out the newsletters, he got a knock on the door one day, and it was three guys in black suits and the hats like that. And the story was that it was going around in the UFO field at the time, not from Bender, but from colleagues who he'd spoken to, was that he'd been visited from agents of some government agency. And the sort of inference or conclusion was that it was the FBI. And the story went that Bender was sort of put the fear of God into him, and he was told that, if you know what's good for you, you'll close this group down and you'll get out of UFO research. And Bender was kind of like a weak-willed, timid person, and so that's exactly what he did. He just walked away. He just did not want anything more to do with it. Now, he told a couple of friends in the UFO field about this, but didn't sort of expand on who the men in black were. And the story got around, it was people from the government. And there was a friend of Bender's named Gray Barker, and Gray Barker wrote a book in 1956 called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which told Bender's story. And again, it alluded to the idea that the men in black were from the government, and that Bender had touched upon something or uncovered something about the truth about UFOs that the government wanted keeping under wraps. And of course, throughout this period, Bender had just vanished. He vanished in 53 and said, I'm done. But because people were still talking about him 10 years later, he decided to sort of briefly come out of retirement again. And he wrote his own book, a very strange book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. And Flying Saucers and the Three Men takes a very different approach to the visitors that Bender said he got. Everybody, as I said, was saying that it was the government, it was the FBI or however. But in Bender's book, he goes right back to the 1940s when his interest in the paranormal began. And he was very much into Ouija boards and contacting spirits and the dead and things like that. But he was also very interested in sort of Gothic fiction, the works of people like Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker, who wrote the Dracula novel. And as I said, he painted the walls of his attic with these strange creatures and had plastic spiders and skulls hanging from the ceiling and all sorts of things. And Bender began as somebody very enthusiastic about the UFO subject, but over time, it was almost as if, as he said himself, something paranormal had got its grips into him. It was kind of like he was digging into all this paranormal activity, and it was like he then showed up on the radar of whatever it was he was looking for, and they targeted him in a sort of very negative way. And he began to get very ill. He got physical illnesses, weird ailments, headaches, migraines, and just sort of really went physically and mentally downhill and decided to walk away from the subject. But at the height of all this, he got these encounters and visits from the Men in Black, and he was sort of very, very solitary character, pretty much kept all his time to himself. And on Saturday nights, he was a big horror fan and science fiction movie fan, and he would go into the local cinema in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to see, the latest sci-fi movie or horror movie that had been released. And he talked about when he was in the cinema, which wasn't that popular, just a small town, he would see these shadowy MIB characters kind of just turn up, who I think have been abducted. They would just kind of turn up on the doorway. They would turn up in the cinema, and he said they would sort of sit in the shadows staring at him. And he kind of described them as like this sort of pale, sunken cheekbones. And he said they had these weird, kind of glowing eyes. And the best way you can describe them, they sound more like something like vampires out of, Hollywood fiction, but dressed in these old-time hats and suits. And he said they would appear and vanish, and he would walk home late at night, and he would feel this sort of ominous presence in the shadows following him, and he would turn around, and there would be this sort of cloaked figure just, staring at him like the Grim Reaper or something like that. And he said on a number of occasions, when he went to bed, he got back home, he would wake up in the middle of the night and feel this ominous presence in the room. And he said it would be three of these characters just staring at him, basically saying, you will leave UFO research. And that is what he did. And that was a story he told in his book, Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Now, of course, that's very different from the story that other people were telling about Bender in the early 50s, that it was a visit from the FBI. I'm not sure even the FBI has the ability to send out agents who've got glowing eyes and who can vanish in the middle of the night. You know, they're talking about something totally different. And that was Bender's story. So it's kind of ironic that the man who really kicked off the Men in Black mystery told a story that was absolutely nothing to do with the imagery that we have of the Men in Black today from the world of Hollywood. But it did sort of set the scene for how the phenomenon developed from the early 1950s. Now, as I said, Bender literally vanished from the subject from 53 to 62 when he came out with his book briefly. But I mean, the book even itself points out that Bender was an unusual character. There's evidence in his book that he suffered from hypochondria. He had a dreaded fear. He was only a young guy at the time. He had a dreaded fear of developing cancer. He definitely had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. As in his own words, he would go crazy if people came round to his house and moved anything out of the bedroom, of his office even slightly. You know, he could tell if it had been moved like that, and he would get angry and replace it, which are sort of classic warning signs of things like that. So, you know, he was unusual, but he was a very credible person because he did set up this big UFO group that had a lot of success. And one of the things I often do when I'm trying to find out more information is to use the Freedom of Information Act to file for documents that might surface, from relevant government agencies. And I actually filed with the FBI for files on Albert Bender and Gray Barker, who wrote the book They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And sure enough, I actually got hold of files on both men. And what was sort of most amazing of all was that there's a document in the file that talks about how none other than the famous FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, actually ordered his agents to get hold of a copy of the book on Bender. And so what we have, and we actually have internal documents now from the FBI and the Air Force saying we want to find out who these guys are, these so-called men in black that are going around threatening members of the US public. So the irony is a lot of people in UFO research think the men in black originate with the government. But now we have documents from the government today from 40 years ago saying we need to find out who the men in black are. So it's almost like the government didn't even know that they recognised that there was something weird going on as well. And that sort of set the scene for how this phenomenon began. So the next one, please. Now that's come out a little bit small, but that's
Jim Mosley.
that's right. Yeah, that's a guy named Jim Mosley, and Jim's still on the UFO scene today. He's about 80, and of course back in the early 50s, you know, he was just in his early 20s or whatever, and getting involved in UFO research. And he writes a magazine today called Saucer Smear, which is kind of funny magazine. It's less about UFOs and it's less all about the scandal of what people in the UFO field are doing. You know, who's lost a driving license through drunk driving, or who's got caught doing whatever. You know, it's kind of like it's like the National Enquirer of ufology or something like that. But Jim does recognise that there's a genuine mystery to the UFO phenomenon. And in the early 1950s, he travelled around the United States with a view to writing a book on the Men in Black. On the UFO subject, with various data on the Men in Black. And one of the things that he found when he was doing the research into the MIB was this weird story about Albert Bender. And he's one of the few people left today, still alive, who had first-hand experience of even meeting Bender and talking to him. And he said, Bender came across as actually a very sort of lucid, open-minded, intelligent person, but someone who was talking about sort of profoundly weird experiences. And even Jim didn't really know what to make of it. And to this day, he's sort of open-minded as to whether or not Bender had an experience with the government that frightened him, maybe even led to nightmares of these weirder Men in Black. Or did he actually get visited by both? Did he have a strange Men in Black experience and the government turned up trying to find out who these weirder MIB that had visited him were? It sort of gets into very weird stories. But, Jim told me about how, he'd met Bender and, was surprised to come across with the idea that he wasn't crazy. He found his story hard to believe, but Bender did come across as like a relatively normal, sane person. And the next one, Joe. Now, one of the more interesting documents that surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act is a document that's surfaced from the US Air Force. It was actually circulated throughout the entire Air Force in 1965. And it's basically a memorandum for the entire Air Force about the Men in Black. And it says something along the lines of reports have reached us from various members of the general public that people are running around the country, sometimes in black suits, sometimes disguised as Air Force personnel, silencing and warning witnesses to UFOs not to talk about their experiences. And the Air Force document says, these people are clearly impersonating government agents. We want to know who they are. We want to try and catch them. So again, this suggests that the MIB weren't from the government, the really weird ones. Now, when it comes to catching the MIB, which is what the government wanted to do, the big problem is that they're so elusive. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's like if you imagine somebody from the FBI or Homeland Security came knocking on your front door, they might do it randomly any time of day. They'd flash an ID card and say, hey, we want to talk to you about ABC or whatever. That's not what happens with the MIB. And this is why, for one reason, they're so elusive. Very often they'll sort of turn up like 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, knock on the front door. Now, most people, you get a knock on the front door at 10 o'clock at night or a phone call, you think it's bad news. It's like, who's knocking on your front door at 11 o'clock? Is it the police, turning up with bad news? So, somebody would rush to the front door and open it and see who it is. And in the MIB cases, they would usually see 3 MIB, again with the hats, the long trench coats, the skinny black ties, even the sunglasses at sort of 11 o'clock at night, these sort of wraparound sunglasses. And it's kind of weird, but it helps explain why the MIB is so elusive. Many people reported that when the MIB turn up, it's almost like their logic and their mindset just goes out of the window. Most people would say, well, number one, you say, well, who are you? I want to see some ID, and no, I'm not letting you in. Most people wouldn't let in 3 guys dressed in black suits, trench coats, and fedoras at 11 o'clock, say, on a Wednesday night. You got better things to do with your time. And even if you haven't, you probably wouldn't let them in. But it's kind of like logic goes out the window, and the people just open the door and they let them in. And, they'll come in and they just sit down, they'll take a seat, and they'll say something like, tell us about your UFO experience. And sometimes the witnesses have actually never said anything to anyone about their experience. So that's, again, one of the stranger things. It's not like, they spilled the story to the newspapers, to family and friends. They might have just kept it to themselves, but somehow the MIB seem to know. And they'll ask questions, about the experience, what do you remember? But they also then start asking weird questions, like how many people live in the house? Have you ever had any strange dreams? One of the questions that people have been asked a number of times, have you had any strange dreams about seeing like triangles or circular shapes in the sky? Have you ever dreamt that you're dead and seen your body, your out of the body experience, seeing your body lying in the bed? All sorts of odd questions like that. Now, even stranger, the witnesses then start just spilling the beans on the entire experience. And then when the MIB are finished, they just get up and leave. They go out the front door, and then it's when the person, it's like logic and common sense start to come back to them. And they think, why do they let those people in? Why do they just tell them everything that happened? It's almost like they're placed under almost like hypnotic trance, where their sort of self-will has been lost. And this is one of the issues where, in the Air Force files where they're talking about trying to track the Men in Black down, why it's become so difficult to find.